Welcome back to the 7th Annual Seoul Climate Energy Conference 2020. We will now begin Part 2 of Plenary 4. I would like to pass the mic on to the moderator of this session, Ji-young, Head of KAIST Graduate School of Green Growth and Director at KAIST GSI's Center for Sustainable Development.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon and good morning for some of you connecting remotely. We had a very interesting discussion this morning on many important issues. We need global leadership, of course, and green finance and green business creation, for sure. But we also need scientific understanding of how people behave, how firms operate, and how businesses are created in order to guide policymaking, green investment, and sustainable development. And this is what KAIST, as an academic and responsible academic institution, can do and should do. We had parallel research discussion around the themes of corporate environmental management, green consumer behavior, IT and sustainability, market and technology policy, and sustainable development and finance, which I believe many of you connecting online enjoyed and provided constructive comments. Now, it's session for research presentations from KAIST students. We have 4 graduate students working on green business and policy issues. Please give them good comments and encourage them to continue to pursue academic undertaking. In this session, if you have any comments or questions, leave message in YouTube chatting box. I will collect those comments and ask presenters to respond between their presentations or at the end of this session. So with that, let us welcome our first presenter, Mr. Shim Jae-ung, for his interesting research. Mr. Shim, the floor is yours.
Share the slides here. So, can you guys see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let me begin. Hello, as Ji-young introduced, I am Jae-young Shim, a PhD candidate at KAIST College of Business, and today I'm going to share my ongoing research titled On the Effectiveness of Smart Metering Technology Adoption, Evidence from the National Rollout in the United Kingdom. So this paper is under revision for resubmission at Journal AIS. So I will be very happy to receive your constructive comments to improve my paper. As you know, all you guys are interested in climate change. So let me briefly explain my motivation. So climate change has become a major threat to humanity. So many governments, including the US or European Union, are adopting smart grid policies. So smart grids indicate information systems enable the power grid to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So they are based on communication of energy information through smart metering technology, which is built in each household, and they inform, real-time information on their household energy consumption amount and expected energy expenses. So they are investing huge amount of money to construct this infrastructure, but recently, these new grids have not sufficiently reached customers yet. So in the UK, the government postponed the rollout policy, and this delay is expected to cause the rise in implementation cost by £500 billion. So many people have discussed this not satisfactory outcomes, but they are mostly focused on penetration rates rather than the reduction in greenhouse gases. So my research objectives are threefold. First is to propose and empirically validate a research model of smart metering adoption and energy saving behaviors. The second is to show how energy-saving motivations interact with information acquisition. And lastly, I aim to provide evidence on the relationship between use of smart metering devices and effectiveness of information on, energy-saving behaviors. Because of time limitation, let me skip this one and briefly introduce my research framework. So, to explain the effectiveness of smart metering adoption on energy-saving behaviors, I relied on the theory of cognitive dissonance. According to the theory, when people observe differences between their prior belief and the reality, they are very eager to reduce this gap. This gap is called dissonance, cognitive dissonance. So they will put more efforts to reduce this dissonance. And in our context, if a household adopted a smart metering devices, then they will observe the differences between their actual adoption and their prior belief on their own consumption. So this would cause cognitive dissonance, and they would try more efforts to reduce this dissonance. So this is how smart metering devices facilitate energy-saving behaviors. In this regard, I proposed that various energy-saving motivations like concern about energy saving, concern about national energy security, or concern about climate change would positively, moderate this relationship. In addition, smart metering devices help consumers by providing information. So consumers can obtain information by monitoring their consumption amounts through in-home displays. So I also proposed that monitoring efforts will positively contribute to this relationship, increasing cognitive dissonance. But this relationship will be nonlinear and what I mean is that the effect of monitoring efforts your marginal effect will be negative. So I tested these hypotheses based on, yearly survey performed by the UK government. In this survey, nationally representative sample of UK households were observed each year, and the research period spans between 2012 and 2016. My major dependent variables, the major outcome is energy-saving behaviors. So this is measured by the sum of the frequency of independent energy-saving behaviors. These are 5 items, specifically 3 of them are wasting behaviors and 2 of them are saving behaviors. And my major independent variable is, smart metering adoption measured by this survey item. Before today, had you heard of smart meters? And if the respondents say yes, then they would answer whether they have smart metering devices or not. This can be validated by, the researchers, UK governments visited each household and measured these items. So I believe that these items are very reliable. In addition, in this survey, they provide, intensity of monitoring behaviors. As you can see here, some consumers look at in-home display occasionally, and others may observe it every day. These energy-saving motivations are used as moderating variables. By this, I mean that the effect of smart metering devices will depend on energy-saving motivations. I also included several control variables like age of female or region or many other things to control for potential confounding factors. As you guys know, my research relies on survey, so I conducted several validation checks for the measurements, and I found that these data are very, very reliable. So I proceed my analysis, and I found that the majority of my hypotheses were supported. Specifically, on average, smart metering adoption is positively associated with energy-saving behaviors. And you can observe that a higher concern about energy saving is negatively associated with energy saving increase in energy-saving behaviors. This is because higher consumption will be positively associated with their prior knowledge on their own consumption. So information gained from adopting smart meters could be lower. On the contrary, higher concern about climate change was positively associated with the increase in energy-saving behaviors. This is because, even when the gap between their prior belief and actual consumption is same, pro-environmental consumers want to be more pro-environmental than others. So if they observe this gap, then they will feel, themselves as a little bit hypocritic or bad feeling about themselves. So they will be more motivated to reduce this gap. So this concern is positively associated with the effect. Lastly, my last hypothesis was about the moderating effect of monitoring behaviors. I found that moderate monitoring effect has a positive additional gain of energy-saving behaviors, but when consumers monitor in-home displays every day, it has no significant marginal effects. And this is not surprising because, smart metering devices provide information, but this information is not very complicating or requiring significant learning. So people can gain the information gain very easily when they observe occasionally, but even though they monitor every day, their information does not improve significantly. This is why I observed nonlinear effects. I also conducted several robustness checks to validate my findings, such as matching approaches or placebo tests or using different ways or different techniques, and I found consistent results. And I also examined whether the current distribution of smart metering devices is close to optimal or not. And I found that these metering devices have adopted by households who would gain little increase in energy-saving behaviors. This means that consumers who are interested in energy issues would be more likely to adopt smart meters because they are interested. They will try their best to increase their energy efficiency, but actually, this device helps consumers through improving energy information. So these consumers may have already higher level of knowledge on their own consumption, so they would gain less. So policymakers should consider optimal households to achieve, higher reduction in greenhouse gases rather than to achieve higher penetration rates of smart metering devices. Actually, this work is in progress, and there are several limitations or ways to go to improve. So I will be very happy to receive comments after the session. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this nice presentation. Okay, so I'm reading now the chatting box from YouTube. I don't see any comments coming in. So just quick question to Mr. Shim Jae-woong. So your finding actually, can I say can I summarize very briefly that people is already doing what they need to do. So in targeting smart meter adoption, the policymakers should be very, very careful. Is that your main message?
Yes, correct. So as you can see here, consumers who were already aware of energy issues are making their best efforts to reduce energy, as you mentioned. So actually, installation of smart metering devices is very costly. It's about 200 euros per household. So it's very costly, but policymakers doesn't seem to consider the cost and benefits for each household. So we need to consider to achieve the maximum reduction in greenhouse gases.
Okay, thank you so much. Very, very, very interesting presentation. This is why we need scientific understanding about the consumer behavior to better guide public policy making. I think this is a very good example. Okay, now the next speaker is Mr. Im Myung-hun Shi will be presenting his work on technology adoption policy. Now the screen is yours. Yep.
Okay, first, let me share the screen. Okay, do you see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, let me start my presentation. Hello, this is Myung-hun Lee, and I am PhD student at KAIST Business School. I'm very glad to make a presentation today, and I will talk about my research, which is about the optimal government subsidy policy. In many countries, government runs several programs to support the development and the purchase of the green technology products, such as electric vehicles and solar panels. And one very important aspect of these programs is that the money that the government can pay is limited, because the government has to spend for other sectors, such as healthcare, military, and other infrastructures. So the government expenditure toward the green industry has to be limited. So the goal of this research is to determine the optimal policy for the government, how to use the limited budget smart. Now, I will show you some examples how the government supports the green technology. Government often use two instruments to support the green technology. The first instrument is the subsidies or incentives to the cost-reducing R&D project, which we call it technology push policy. And the second instrument is the direct incentives to the customers, which we call it demand pull policy. And solar industry is a good example. In the United States, US government supports the R&D of firms producing solar panels, and they provided about $31 million for the development of solar panels. And the customers who purchase the solar panel system can get a tax rebate up to 26% of the total installation cost. The first research question is about the allocation of limited budget between the two instruments. First one is R&D, and the second one is the purchase subsidy. Also, the market environment changes over time. Korean government is reducing the amount of money that goes to the EV customers, and other countries like US, China, Japan, and many European countries are also reducing the amount of incentives to the solar panels and the electric vehicles. So I analyzed how should the government adjust the amount of subsidies over time as a second research question. And another important aspect of these R&D projects is that there's a technology spillover for the investment. If a firm spends money for a better technology, competitor can simply learn from that technology with just a lower amount of investment. So the third question is to identify the optimal government policy when the competition and the technology spillover exist in the market. So for an analysis, I utilized game theoretic models for the analysis. I introduced three players, a government, and two competing manufacturers. To describe the competition between the firms, I used chrono competition model, where the customer characteristic is represented by an inverse demand function. In my model, demand goes down as the price goes up, and demand goes up as the price goes down. So given the circumstances, manufacturers try to maximize their own profit, and the government tried to maximize the market consumption by spending the budget. Now I will introduce three interesting results of my analysis. I found that when the government allocates the limited budget between the two, the first one was R&D and the second one was the purchase, then I found that it is optimal for the government to provide more subsidies to the R&D when the budget is tight. Otherwise, if the government can provide large amount of subsidies, then it was optimal to subsidize the customer purchase instead of R&D. This is because purchase subsidies and R&D subsidies are substitutes for an R&D investment. Also, purchase subsidy is relatively expensive. R&D subsidy gives direct incentives to invest on R&D to the manufacturers. But the purchase subsidy do not directly give an incentive to invest on R&D. Instead, manufacturers tend to increase the price to benefit from more demand, rather than producing more or invest on R&D, especially when the budget is tight. By the way, when the government has a large amount of budget, government can spend lots of purchase subsidy, and it not only boosts the customer demand. This makes the firms to invest on R&D aggressively, even if the government provides less amount of R&D subsidy. And the second research question was about the adjustment of subsidies over time. And I found that it is optimal for the government to provide more amount of money when the market potential is small, and provide less if the market is big. This is because the purchase subsidy is evenly paid to all the customers. When providing large amount of subsidy to the bigger market, customers that are willing to buy the product, even without the subsidy, would also get a grant. And the money is wasted without making any extra demand. So the government can use the budget more efficiently by providing more in the earlier stage of the market. And the last result is about the effect of technology spillover. One might think that more subsidy has to be paid when the technology spillover is high, because the amount of cost reduction is larger when the firms do R&D in the existence of strong spillover. But my analysis show that this is not always true, because firms tend to invest less when the technology spillover is prevalent. So the government has to pay more money to make firms to invest on R&D. And it is optimal for the government to even decrease the amount of R&D subsidy, especially when the opportunity cost of the government expenditure is high. And this is the end of my presentation, and I will be expecting for comments or questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So let me, before we go to the next, let me ask one quick question. So just to, just one question is, giving more subsidy, higher subsidy in early stage of technology adoption. No, that is already well-known understanding in the government subsidy program. But what you found is how does your finding distinguish from earlier studies in terms of the subsidy profiles over time? What do you think is your new finding?
Well, that's true. Actually, the government are reducing the amount of subsidies to the EVs and the solar panels as the market majors. It's a well-known already well known to many people. But I studied the interaction between technology spillover and the market development. When the technology spillover exists, then the manufacturers will tend not to invest on R&D in the existence of high technology spillover in the earlier market. And higher subsidies to the earlier market might resolve this kind of strategic underinvestment decisions of the R&D. So the difference from the common knowledge is that I studied the correlation and the interactions between the technology spillover.
Great, great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is why we do research. So new understanding, new science into policy. Okay, so our last presenter, speaker, Yeonjung Lee, she will be presenting her recent research in this session. So the floor is yours, Yeonjung Lee. Could you start?
Yes, thank you, Professor. Good afternoon. And for those of you in Korea, hope you all enjoyed some lunch. This is Yeonjung Lee. I'm in my first year of Green Business Policy Master's Program, and I'm very honored to present my research today. It's a preliminary research to further understand how climate change adaptation ODA is being rolled out. These are the contents of my presentation. As NDCs are due by the end of the year, I think we're hearing more and more on Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement stressed upon mainly three things: the importance of mitigation, as well as adaptation, and the utilization of climate finance. As climate finance is one of the core aspects that will lead us to sustainable growth, there's much talks around it. According to World Bank, the global economy will need to invest $4 trillion by 2030 to meet the stabilization target. And the developed nation has also pledged to mobilize $100 billion a year by year 2020. Then what is climate finance? The UNFCCC defines it as local, national, or transnational financing that seeks to support mitigation and adaptation actions that will address climate change. The Paris Agreement called for new and additional funds to be channeled. However, if we look at the reality, there is a blurred line between climate finance and existing climate change ODA. Actually, majority of public climate finance flowing from developed to developing countries is said to be in the form of development aid. Whether or not climate finance should be separated from ODA is another important issue to be addressed, but I thought taking a look at ODA flows would also contribute to assessing the status quo of the climate finance. I'd like to shed more light upon the adaptation efforts because of the impact it has on poverty reduction and sustainable development. Simply put, it's more important to the developing countries. Not only more than half of the adaptation ODA is poured into the low-income countries, but also it has proven to synergize with other developmental projects. The adaptation ODA refers to the activities that aim to reduce the vulnerability to the impacts of climate change and related risks by bettering adaptive capacity and resilience. The common belief is that adaptation ODA is not channeled to the right places. Political, economic, and other forces could influence the aid allocations. To better utilize the limited financial resources, we cannot disregard the allocation of funding. Therefore, my question is whether adaptation ODA is efficiently channeled into countries in need. In specific, I'd like to find out if higher the vulnerability and lower the adaptive capacity, more funding is being allocated. Now let me go on to the literature review. Betzold and Weiler already took a similar approach to this problem by asking whether vulnerable countries receive more support. The author set adaptation ODA as the dependent variable and attempted to capture vulnerability and adaptive capacity with various indices. One finding was that vulnerability to climate change did matter for adaptation aid allocation. However, the difference was small in absolute terms. When regarding climate risk index, most vulnerable countries received only $3 per capita more than the least vulnerable ones. However, the analysis didn't show the relevance between adaptive capacity and adaptation aid allocation. Rather, it was biased towards middle-income countries. Next, I'd like to point out two limitations from the research. First of all, the period of the research seemed too narrow. Adaptation marker was recorded from 2010. Thus, analyzing only a few years right after the introduction of the marker didn't seem so convincing. Moreover, I wondered if their findings will have consistency over time. Second is that their proxy for adaptive capacity, GDP, can only capture the affluence of a country. However, adaptive capacity depends on various factors, including education level, perception on climate change, and risk perception. While not everything could be quantified, I'd like to suggest alternating or diversifying the proxy. Taking this in mind, I'll go on to the methodology. To address the previously mentioned limitations, I'd like to conduct my research for a broader period and changing the proxy from GDP to Human Development Index. The HDI captures the affluence with GNI and also takes into account quality of life and education level. However, I didn't include both indices in order to avoid multicollinearity. To elaborate a little on data selection, All ODA data will be obtained from the OECD statistics. I'm only taking into account the bilateral ODA, which was screened for climate change adaptation. And for the regression model, there are 4 independent variables and 2 dummies. The elevation means the percentage of population living below elevation of 5 meters, and it represents the physical risk faced at present. And the Global Climate Risk Index captures the increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. This shows the short-term vulnerability from climate change. And the Environmental Vulnerability Index shows the long-term vulnerability from climate change. And lastly, the HDI serves as a proxy for adaptive capacity. Now I'd like to conclude my presentation by briefly going over future directions. I plan to refine the regression model a bit more. Firstly, I'll have to find out if elevation and CRI overlaps as proxies. The authors in the original research did use both in their studies, but I'd like to dig deeper on this issue. Then I'm also considering to segregate the income level among the recipient countries, because we've seen that adaptation ODA had different relations among low income and middle income countries. And additional treatment of the data might be needed to better analyze the results. Then, of course, through appropriate analyses, I'd like to draw relevant policy implications for adaptation ODA. This is all from my side, and thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. The Yeonjung Lee shared her current research progress in this climate adaptation ODA, which I think is very, very important, and then she's approaching the right direction, I believe. My quick question to you is, I think you properly captured the components of vulnerability in terms of the exposure, climate exposure, and adaptive capacity as very well. But do you have any plan to incorporate climate sensitivity to climate risks, such as the structure of economy or demographic structure, something like that, which I think is another important element of climate change vulnerability?
Thank you, Professor for asking the question. I would very like to revise the model more, taking into various accounts, and I'll remember to refine the model based on your questions. And also one more point was that I'd also wanted to take resilience into account. However, I couldn't find the appropriate indices yet. There were only frameworks and indices according to the regional level. So maybe further on my research, I could find more appropriate ones to include and better the regression model. Thank you.
Okay, now is Q&A session, discussion session for all of you guys. You can join from YouTube channel. So if you leave your questions or comments, then I will ask presenters to answer those questions. And also because I don't see any comments coming up, so let me ask maybe presenters, our extremely talented presenters, to ask questions to other speakers. If you have any questions, who'd like to start first? Maybe Shim Jae-woo.
Yeah. So I have a question to Byung-hun. Your paper was about government actions and R&D, right? Different effects of R&D and subsidies to pro-environmental or renewable energies, right? Like this, we are right.
Yes,
So,
you're right.
How about the different contexts like EV? So in that context, governments provide subsidy, and they also provide infrastructure. They may help provide infrastructures like charger stations, or of course I think many firms build their own charger station by themselves, but government may help that kind of thing. So what do you expect that if helping infrastructures would change your results?
Okay, I understand your question. That is very interesting question, and it's a good question. My research was about providing two instruments. I consider two instruments. One instrument was the subsidies to the R&D, which directly benefits the manufacturers, and the second instrument was purchase subsidies to the customers. But the charging station subsidies that you have mentioned is that actually charging stations benefit the customers. So purchase subsidies and the charging station subsidies, these both are related to the customer side. So in my opinion, if I take account the charging station into my model, then I can simply just adjust the customer utility function by just adding up some kind of terms into the utility function. So I think charging station subsidies will act similar as just direct purchase subsidies. And yeah, thank you. I really appreciate your question.
Yeah, that actually was very, very important question. And another way to look at that kind of problem is maybe the frequency or the number of charging station can increase the utility of consumers as well. So that factor into in a different way, different from the usual consumer goods and services. So I think maybe that also maybe you can improve your model by factoring that aspects into account. Any other question to any of you? Maybe Yeonjung Lee, do you have any questions to?
Sure. May I ask a question to Jae-Ung Shin?
Yeah.
This might not be an appropriate question for your paper per se. However, I was wondering, the results of your research or the views would change if smart meters become a default. For instance, if we're like building a region with smart meters established from the start, do you think would that change the perception of residents living there? Do you think if you constructed your study between those kind of regions and other regions who doesn't have smart meters as defaults, would it have different results?
I think you are talking about the heterogeneity across regions, right? Yeah. So actually, this is another limitation of my research. My advisor and I contacted the UK government to obtain regional information, but they did not provide us because they said that regional information is so private. So actually, in my model, the indicator of whether the region is rural or urban is collected, but I did not find significant differences between rural and urban, but deeper understanding could be obtained if I have information on the specific regional information, but I was not able to investigate that. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Now we have one question coming up from YouTube. the question is, I think, is made from Karen, and I have a question for Min Hyung's research. Why do you think bike sharing had a greater uptake among men instead of women?
Thank you for your question. I think this is because usually the size of the bicycles are designed for the average people's size. So maybe for the females or women's, the size of the bicycle could be too big for them, so they will not use it regularly than the man. Or usually the male people ride bicycles more when they were in the teenagers to commute to school. So maybe that's the reason why they the male people ride bicycle more than the female customers.
Okay. Okay. So we still have maybe another couple of minutes. Any questions? Maybe Myung-hun or Min-hyung, do you have any questions to other speakers?
I have one question to Jeong Sim. I also study about the energy saving behavior as well. So especially for saving energies, I think that the financial incentives or the pricing system is really important. So how did you consider these kind of things in your research, or do you have any plans to consider the pricing system in UK or the tariff system of the water or the electricity in the UK in the future research?
Well, no, there could be many another directions to extend my research, but the data set was actually constructed not for smart meters. So this was basically intended to measure people's attitudes toward energy policies. So there were only a few items on energy saving behaviors or IT related variables, but I am planning to analyze additional data sets from the United States. I don't have appropriate data set for UK, but I have one for the United States. So it has a lot of variables like ownership of devices, household devices, and the actual level of energy consumption. So I think I can extend my analysis to different contexts in that data set, but I have to investigate further, but not yet. So that's a very great point, and I think it'll be a very good way to improve my paper. Thank you so much.
Okay. So this finishes up the session, the research presentation session, and we had a very interesting presentation on adoption of smart meter technology for impact and also subsidy and R&D policy and the effect of sharing economy and also allocation of ODA, climate adaptation ODA fund, which I think all of those topics are very much important because we know there is no silver bullet in this climate arena. So we need understanding in every part of economy, in every part of consumer decision making and public policy decision making. So I think the students' research actually advanced our understanding and will advance our understanding about the market and human behavior, and will accelerate our transition to green and resilient economy. Thank you so much, and then stay with us for our next interesting, exciting session. Thank you.
Thank you all for your presentations and discussion. I especially enjoyed this plenary as a means of contextualizing this year's theme of green finance and business creation in the climate crisis era, because I felt the student presentations pay greater attention to other stakeholders outside of businesses, such as the role of governments and consumers. We will now take a break and restart at 2:10 for the final plenary. Please return for then.